I still remember the day my grandson laughed at my car like it was yesterday. The sun was shining bright, the kind of golden morning that makes you think the world might still hold a few soft miracles. I was driving up to David's house in my old dusty blue Ford sedan, the one that had carried me through half of my life. Its paint was faded, the radio barely worked, and the engine had a cough louder than an old man clearing his throat. But that car was more than metal and wheels to me. It was a piece of my heart, a reminder of the man who had once loved me more than anything. When I parked in the driveway and stepped out, David was waiting on the porch with his son Ben, my only grandson, who had just turned 16. He had that grin teenagers wear when they think they know more about the world than the people who built it. "Grandma, you really still drive that thing," he said, laughing and shaking his head. "That's like prehistoric." David chuckled softly, but I could see he was trying not to encourage him. I smiled and said gently, "It may be old, sweetheart, but it still gets me where I need to go." Ben smirked and said, "You should let Dad buy you something new, Grandma. You could have a real car, not that antique." I laughed softly and said, "Maybe someday, honey. But this car and I have been through a lot together." Ben rolled his eyes the way only teenagers can and went back inside with his phone glued to his hand. I stood there for a moment watching him go and felt that quiet ache a grandmother feels when she realizes her little boy isn't so little anymore. David looked at me and said quietly, "Don't take it to heart, Mom. You know how kids are these days." I smiled. "It's all right, honey. He's young. He'll understand one day." That afternoon we had lunch together in the backyard. The air was warm and smelled like cut grass and grilled chicken. The boys played basketball while Julia, my daughter-in-law, sat at the table. She was a good woman, practical and kind, though a little sharp around the edges sometimes. She always treated me with respect, though, and for that I was grateful. As we ate, David talked about work and the boys and the usual family things, but my mind kept drifting back to Ben's laughter at the car. I didn't blame him. Of course, he was a child of shiny screens and electric cars and fast things. But that old Ford meant something deeper to me. It was the last gift my husband George ever gave me before he passed. George and I had been married for 42 years. He was a mechanic by trade and an artist by heart. He could fix anything, but he loved that Ford more than any car he had ever worked on. He used to say, "Evelyn, this car's got soul, just like you do when he bought it." He didn't just give me transportation, he gave me freedom. After he died in that quiet hospital room 15 years ago, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Every time I sat behind the wheel, I could still feel him there, his hand on the gear shift, his voice humming along to the old country songs that played through the static. That night after dinner, David helped me carry my bags to the car and said, "Mom, you sure you don't want to stay the night?" I said, "No, honey. I've got my routine. You know, I like sleeping in my own bed." He nodded, kissed my cheek and said, "Drive safe." Okay, as I turned the key, the engine rattled like it always did, but I smiled because it still started strong. I drove down the quiet road lined with trees, the sunset bleeding gold through the branches, and I whispered, "Thank you, George, for keeping her running." A few weeks later, it was Ben's birthday. Big 17, David and Julia had planned a family barbecue and invited me to come early to help with the food. I drove up again in the Ford, and as soon as Ben saw me, he called out to his friends, "Hey guys, check out Grandma's car. It's like a museum exhibit." They all laughed, not cruelly, just the way teenagers do. I smiled, but inside my chest ached a little. One of the boys said, "Dude, my grandpa had one like that before it broke down." Ben laughed and said, "Guess Grandma D doesn't believe in upgrades." I just waved and said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," and handed him a neatly wrapped box. He said, "Thanks, Grandma," without looking up from his phone. I spent the afternoon helping Julia with the food and trying not to feel invisible. After a while, I went outside to get something from my car and saw Ben standing there with his friends pretending to take selfies with it. One of them said, "Man, your grandma's ride is ancient." Ben said, "I know, right, but she loves it for some reason." I didn't say anything. I just smiled and walked back inside. But that night, as I drove home, I found myself crying quietly. Not because I was angry, but because I missed a time when kindness was simple, when children understood love without needing to be reminded. The next morning, I woke early and made a decision. It was time to tell Ben the story of that car. Maybe then he'd understand. That weekend, David and the family came to visit me. I made pancakes the way Ben liked them, with chocolate chips and too much syrup after breakfast. I said, "Ben, would you come help me in the garage for a bit?" He sighed but followed me. The garage smelled of oil and old wood. The Ford sat there gleaming faintly under the single bulb light. I handed him a rag and said, "Let's clean her up a bit." He shrugged and started wiping the dust off the hood. Then I said softly, "You know, your grandpa gave me this car." He looked up surprised. "Really? I thought you just bought it a long time ago." I smiled. "No, sweetheart. Your grandpa saved for months to buy it for me. It was our anniversary. He wanted me to have something that was just mine, because back then I didn't have much of anything. He said this car would carry our dreams and our memories." Ben looked at me differently now. "What was Grandpa like?" he asked. I took a deep breath. He was brave and kind. He worked hard even when life was unfair. He had hands rough from labor, but a heart so soft it could make you believe in miracles. He taught me that love isn't what you say, it's what you do. We spent hours in that garage. I told him stories about George, the long road trips, the nights we slept in that car when we had nowhere else to go, the time it broke down in the middle of nowhere, and we laughed until we cried waiting for help by the end of it. Ben wasn't laughing anymore. He was listening with eyes full of something new, maybe respect, maybe understanding. Before they left that evening, he said quietly, "Grandma, can I take a picture with the car?" I smiled and said, "Of course, honey." He took a photo this time, not to mock, but to remember. That night when they drove off, I sat in the car alone for a while and whispered, "You see, George, he's starting to understand." The next few months were good. Ben came by often sometimes, just to help me wash the car or bring me groceries one day. He said, "Grandma, could you tell me how to drive stick shift?" I grinned and said, "Only if you promise to be gentle." She laughed and said, "Deal." Teaching him to drive that old car became one of my favorite things. The first time he stole it, he blushed and said, "Guess she's tougher than I thought." I said, "She's patient like me, but she won't take care of you if you don't respect her." He laughed, but I saw the meaning sink in. We drove around quiet country roads, the windows down, wind rushing through our hair. I told him about how George used to whistle during drives, how he'd tell me stories about his childhood, how we'd stop at diners just to share one slice of pie. We passed the old diner still standing, and I said that's where he told me he'd love me forever. Ben was silent for a while, then said softly, "Grandma, I'm sorry for making fun of your car. I didn't know." I touched his hand and said, "That's all right, honey, now you do." As we parked back in the driveway, he said, "Grandma, this car's kind of amazing. It's like history you can touch." I smiled and said, "That's because love leaves fingerprints on everything. It touches even metal." That night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars, I felt George's presence like a soft whisper in the breeze. I knew he'd be proud. The next weekend, Ben came over again. He was different, somehow quieter, more thoughtful. He had brought his friend Chris along, and as they stepped into the garage, I could see that same old car gleaming in the light like it had been waiting for us. "Grandma," Ben said shyly, "can we take it out again, maybe to the diner you talked about?" I smiled. "You're the driver this time. Remember," he grinned nervously and said, "Yeah, but only if you promise not to yell if I stole it." I laughed softly. "Sweetheart, I've lived through a lot worse than a stalled engine." We climbed into the car, the seats creaking the way old leather does, but the smell was still there. That faint trace of George's cologne mixed with the scent of time. Ben started the engine, and though it groaned, it came to life strong and steady, just like it always had. As we drove down the same country road where George and I used to travel, I watched Ben from the passenger seat. He was careful, gentle, respectful of the car, like it was alive. And in that moment, I thought maybe he was starting to understand that it wasn't just a car, it was memory. It was love made solid in steel and dust. When we reached the diner, the bell over the door jingled just the same as it did decades ago. The same red booths, the same smell of coffee and pie lingered in the air. The waitress smiled and said, "Haven't seen you in a while, Evelyn." I grinned. "Oh, I'm still around, just moving a little slower these days." She laughed and said, "You look good, girl. You always do." Ben and Chris looked around like they had stepped back in time, and Ben said softly, "So this is where you and Grandpa used to come?" I nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, this was our place. We'd sit in that corner booth, order 1 slice of cherry pie and 2 coffees because that's all we could afford back then, but it was enough, more than enough." We sat down and I told them about the nights George and I spent talking about dreams, about how we wanted a little house and a big family, and how we never thought life would give us both. Then I told them how we almost lost it all once. It was the winter of '79. The factory George worked at had closed suddenly and we had no money coming in. The bills piled up, the rent was overdue, and every day I could see the worry in his eyes, but he never complained. He'd just say, "We'll figure it out, Evie, we always do." Then one evening a neighbor told us about a job in another town 200 miles away. It wasn't much, but it was something. The problem was we didn't have enough for the trip, gas, food, nothing. I remember sitting at the kitchen table crying quietly. When George walked in with that same Ford key in his hand, he smiled and said, "Don't cry, sweetheart, we'll make it work somehow, we always do." He sold his tools, his watch, even his old guitar, the one he loved, just to buy gas money. He said, "This car will carry us through Evelyn." And it did. We drove through the snow, the wind so fierce it nearly pushed us off the road, but we made it to that town and he got the job. For months we lived out of that car, sometimes sleeping in it when we couldn't afford rent. We'd wake up to frost on the windows, but he'd always say, "Look, honey, we got another sunrise. That means we're still in the game." I smiled through the tears as I told the boys that story, and Ben just sat there quietly, no jokes, no smirks, only understanding. When we left the diner and drove home, he said softly, "Grandma, I think Grandpa was a hero." I looked at him and said he was sweetheart, but not because he was strong or rich. He was a hero because he never gave up even when everything was against him. That night, after I dropped Ben and his friend off, David called me and said, "Mom, Ben won't stop talking about Grandpa and the car. He even told me he wants to restore it with you this summer." I smiled so big my cheeks hurt. "That would be wonderful," I said. So that summer became one of the best of my life. Every weekend Ben came over, sometimes with his friends, sometimes alone. We worked on the or together, polishing, painting, fixing small things. He was learning fast, and every now and then he'd ask me to tell him another story about George. Sometimes he'd even record me on his phone. He said he wanted to keep them forever. One evening while we were working, he asked Grandma, "Did Grandpa really buy you this car, or was it given to him?" I froze for a second because that question brought back a memory I hadn't told anyone for years. I sat down on the old wooden stool, wiped my hands, and said softly, "It was given to him, Ben, but not in the way you might think. Back in the early years before your dad was born, George was drafted into the army. He didn't talk about it much after, but it changed him when he came home. Things were hard. He couldn't find steady work, and there were nights we barely had anything to eat. One day a man showed up at the shop where George was trying to get a job. He was older, kind with a limp. He recognized George right away, said they'd served together overseas. The man's name was Harold, and he owned a small car garage. He said George had once saved his life when a vehicle overturned in the middle of a storm overseas. Harold said, "I've been looking for a way to repay you." The next week, Harold showed up at our door with a smile and a key in his hand. He said, "I was fixing this car for my daughter, but she moved away. Take it, it's yours. You've already paid for it with your kindness." George refused at first, said he couldn't take something so valuable. But Harold insisted. He said, "You saved my life. This is nothing compared to that. That car, Ben, that old Ford, was a gift from gratitude and courage, a gift built on friendship and sacrifice, and George took care of it like it was sacred. Every time he fixed something, he'd say, 'I'm not just fixing a car, I'm keeping a promise.'" Ben's eyes were wide as he listened. He said, "So the car wasn't just Grandpa's. It was a thank you from someone he helped." I nodded. "That's right, honey, and now it's a reminder that kindness always finds its way back." The next day, Ben told me he wanted to learn how to fix engines the way Grandpa did. He said, "Maybe one day I'll open a shop like he had and call it George's Garage." I laughed through tears and said that would make him so proud. As the months passed, We finished restoring the fort together. The paint was still the same old blue, but it gleamed like the ocean under the sun when we were done. Ben said, "Grandma, we should take her for one last long ride together before I go to college." I smiled and said I'd love that, sweetheart. We drove for hours that day, through the countryside, past the hills and open fields. The windows were down, and the radio was playing those old songs George loved. Ben sang along, even though he didn't know the words, and I laughed till my eyes watered. Then, as the sun began to set, Ben parked by a quiet lake and turned to me. "Grandma, thank you for telling me everything," he said. "I used to think this car was just old metal, but now I know it's full of stories and love and memories." He paused for a moment and then said, "When you're gone someday, I'll take care of it. I promise I'll never let it go." Tears filled my eyes, but I smiled. "That's all I wanted to hear, sweetheart, because this car isn't just mine anymore. It's yours too." That night when we returned home, I sat alone in the car for a long time. The moonlight spilled through the windshield, and I felt George there, like he always was. I whispered softly, "We did good, honey. He understands now." A few weeks later, the air had turned crisp, and golden leaves were falling across the driveway. Ben was packing for college, and I could see the excitement in his eyes, mixed with that quiet nervousness that comes when you're about to start a new chapter in life. He said, "Grandma, I'm going to miss our Saturdays." I smiled and said, "Me too, sweetheart. But you'll be back before you know it. Just don't forget how to hold a wrench." He laughed and said, "Never." Before he left, he surprised me. He handed me a small box wrapped in paper with grease stay. "An S on it," he said. "I made this for you. Open it when you're alone." Later that night, after he drove home, I sat in the quiet kitchen and opened the box. Inside was a small wooden keychain carved in the shape of the old Ford. It had the letters GE carved into it, for George and Evelyn. My heart swelled and tears slipped down my cheeks. He had done it with his own hands. I could tell it was rough, uneven, but perfect. The next morning, when I went to start the car, I noticed something strange. The engine hesitated, sputtered, and then went silent. I tried again, but nothing, just a quiet hum, like it was trying to breathe, but couldn't. For a second, my heart sank because it felt like losing a friend. I called the mechanic, and he said it might be time to let the car go, that it had given me all it could. I thanked him, but deep down I knew I couldn't let it end that way, not without trying one more time. So I rolled up my sleeves, grabbed the old tools from the shed, and got to work. I had watched George fix this engine more times than I could count. I remembered how he'd hum while tightening bolts or whisper little prayers under his breath when something wouldn't fit. I did the same thing, and for hours I worked until the hands ached. The sun went down, and the chill crept in, but I didn't stop. I talked to the car like he could hear me. I said, "Come on, sweetheart. We've been through worse. You can do this." When I finally turned the key again, there was a long pause, then a cough, then that familiar deep rumble. The sound filled the garage, and I burst into tears. I whispered, "Thank you, George. Thank you for teaching me not to give up that night." I sat behind the wheel and thought about how every part of this car carried something of him, his touch, his love, his courage. A few days later, I got a call from Ben. His voice sounded shaken. "Grandma," he said, "I got into a small accident. Nothing serious, but my friend's car is totaled. I'm fine, but I feel awful." My heart stopped for a second. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" No, he said, "just a few scratches." "But Grandma, it made me think about what you said about how life can change in a second. I just wanted to tell you that I love you." I smiled through the tears. "I love you too, Ben, more than you'll ever know." The next weekend he came home just to visit. He said he needed a little time away from the noise of college. He looked older somehow, not by years but by heart. We went for a drive in the Ford again. He said, "Grandma, can I tell you something I've been thinking about?" I nodded. He said, "When I laughed at your car that day, I didn't just laugh at the car, I laughed at everything you worked for. I was being selfish and spoiled. I thought being rich meant having new things, but now I know being rich means having stories like yours." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You learned something most people take a lifetime to understand, sweetheart." We drove in silence for a while until we reached a place I hadn't been in years. It was the old field where George had first taught me how to drive. The grass was taller now, the fence was leaning, and the road had faded into gravel. But when I looked around, it still felt like yesterday. Ben said softly, "You and Grandpa really built everything from nothing, huh?" I nodded. "Yes, we did, honey. We built it with faith and stubbornness and love." Then he looked at me and said, "Grandma, when I have a family, I want to raise my kids the way you and Grandpa raised Dad, with love and hard work, not just gifts and phones." I smiled, proud beyond words. That night, after Ben went to bed, I sat outside on the porch, wrapped in an old quilt. The stars were bright and the air was cool. I thought about how fast time moves, how one moment you're holding your child hand, and the next they're grown with children of their own. Life changes so quickly, but love stays the same. It just finds new hands to hold. The next morning I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in years, the deep soft roar of a new engine. I stepped outside, and there it was. A truck was pulling up with a covered TR. Ailer Ben was standing there grinning. "Grandma, close your eyes," he said. I laughed. "What did you do now?" He said, "Trust me, just close them." When I opened them, my breath caught the trailer. Door opened, and inside was a perfect restoration of the Ford's twin, an exact model, same year, same blue paint, only this one looked like it had just rolled off the factory floor. Ben said, "Grandma, I found a man online who restores old cars. I told him everything about Grandpa, about your story, and he said he wanted to help. We worked on it together this summer, in secret. It's not meant to replace yours," he said. "It's meant to honor it." For a moment I couldn't speak. The tears came before the words did. I walked over, touched the car, and said softly, "Oh, George, you'd love this. You'd be so proud." Ben hugged me tight and said, "This one's for you, Grandma, for all the miles you've traveled and all the lessons you've taught me." A few days later, we decided to do something special. We organized a little gathering at the community park. I invited some of the neighbors, people who'd known George long ago, and Ben invited his friends. We parked both Fords side by side, one old and one new, and people came up to take pictures and listen as I told the story. I spoke about how life had been hard, how we'd lost things and started over again and again, but how every time we kept moving forward. I said, "Sometimes you don't need the newest thing, you just need the thing that still carries your heart." People clapped, some even cried, and Ben stood beside me, smiling with pride. It felt like George was there too, watching from somewhere, smiling that same easy smile he always had when something good finally worked out. Later that evening, when everyone had gone home, Ben and I sat on the tailgate of the new Ford eating pie from the diner. He said, "Grandma, I used to think heroes were people who fought battles or made headlines, but now I know they're people like you and Grandpa, people who stay kind even when life isn't, people who keep going when everything tells them to stop." I looked at him and said, "Heroes aren't made in loud moments, sweetheart. They're made in quiet ones when nobody's watching and you still choose to love anyway." As the sun dipped behind the trees, I felt that same peace I used to feel sitting beside George. The years, the pain, the joy, it all came together in that moment. The car, the stories, the laughter, it all meant one thing: love never dies, it just changes hands. That night before bed, Ben came into my room and said, "Grandma, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. He said, "When Grandpa died, how did you keep going? How did you not fall apart?" I thought for a long moment, then said, "Because falling apart wouldn't bring him back, sweetheart, but living well, keeping our memories alive. That's how I stayed close to him every single day." He smiled and said, "Then I guess you've done a pretty good job, because I feel like I know him, even though I never met him." I said softly, "That's the best thing anyone's ever told me." As I drifted off to sleep later that night, I thought about all the miles that car had carried me, from joy to heartbreak to healing. It wasn't just metal and wheels, it was a vessel for love, for lessons for generations to come. A few months passed. After that perfect summer, the air turned cool again, and the first hints of autumn painted the trees in gold and red. Ben had gone back to college, and the house was quieter. Now the Ford sat in the garage side by side with its new twin, both of them shining even under the dust of the changing season. I spent my mornings sitting by the window, sipping tea, thinking about how quickly life changes. One year, you are the one teaching; the next, you are the one being remembered. I never thought a simple car could become the bridge between generations, but that's what it had become. Ben would call every Sunday. He'd ask Grandma how's the Ford running, and I'd always say she's running strong, sweetheart, just like me. One Sunday, though, he didn't call. I thought maybe he was busy WY exams. But by the next day, I started to worry. Finally, that evening, the phone rang, but it wasn't Ben, it was David, his father. His voice was tight, strained. Mom, he said Ben was in an accident. For a moment, the world stopped. My hand shook, and I could barely whisper, is he alive, David? Yes, Mom, he's alive, thank God, but he's in the hospital. He has a concussion and a broken leg, but he'll be okay. He's asking for you. I drove to the hospital in that same old Ford. The night was cold, and my hands trembled the whole way. I kept whispering under my breath, please let him be all right, George. Please help me now. When I got there and saw Ben lying in that hospital bed, pale but smiling weakly, my knees almost gave out. He looked up at me and said softly, Grandma, I crashed into a pole, but I'm okay. I promise the car's gone. Though I couldn't stop the tears, I sat beside him and took his hand. You scared me half to death, sweetheart. He smiled faintly. I know, Grandma, I'm sorry. For the next few days I stayed by his side, bringing him soup, reading to him and telling him stories about George. He said it helped him sleep. He said he felt like Grandpa was still watching over him. Then one night while the room was quiet, he looked at me and said, Grandma, do you believe in signs? I said, of course I do, sweetheart. Sometimes God sends us gentle reminders through the things we love. He nodded slowly and said, when the car crashed, Grandma, I swear I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, calm and steady. He said, hold on, son, you're not done yet. It sounded just like the voice from the recordings you told me about of Grandpa's old radio. I didn't see anyone, but I felt safe. I felt like he was right there. I smiled through my tears. Maybe he was, sweetheart. Maybe love doesn't just fade away. Maybe it follows us through the hard times. When Ben recovered fully, he came home for a while to rest. The first thing he did was walk into the garage and look at the old Ford. He touched the hood gently and said, you made it through everything, didn't you, Grandma? I said, yes, she did, just like we did. He turned to me and said, Grandma, I want to start a project. I want to restore cars like this for people who can't afford new ones. I'll call it George's Garage, like we talked about. I'll help single mothers, veterans, anyone who needs a start. Just like Grandpa did, I want to make people believe again that old things still have value. My heart swelled with pride. That's beautiful, honey. He grinned wide. That's what Grandpa would have done, right? I nodded. That's exactly what he would have done. So he started the project. It was slow at first. He worked out of a small rented space downtown using borrowed tools and second-hand parts. But word began to spread. People came from all over town, some with broken-down cars, others just to hear the story of the old Ford, the story of love and kindness and courage that inspired it all. Ben always told them, Grandma taught me that strength doesn't come from money or power, it comes from kindness and not giving up when the road gets rough. Soon the garage became something more than a workshop. It became a place of hope. People came not just for repairs, but for company, for conversation, for a reminder that good still existed in the world. I'd often stop by with homemade cookies and sit in the corner watching him work. He'd glance over and wink, and I'd smile knowing George would have loved this. Then one day a man walked in wearing an old army jacket. He looked around quietly and then said softly, Are you Ben by any chance? Ben nodded. The man smiled. I knew your grandfather. Harold was my father. The name hit us both like a wave. Harold, the man who gave George the Ford decades ago. The man said, my father told me about George. He said there was no man kinder or more loyal. He passed away last year, but before he did, he told me to find your family someday and tell you that he never forgot. He said that car saved his life in more ways than one. Ben's eyes filled with tears. He shook the man's hand and said, Thank you for coming, sir. That car meant everything to us, too. The man smiled. That car carried a lot of heart, son. I'm glad it's still here. After he left, Ben looked at me with awe. Grandma, do you see it? It's like everything came full circle. I nodded softly. Yes, sweetheart, kindness always circles back. Years passed and the garage grew, the walls filled with photos of people who'd brought their car stories scribbled underneath about how Ben and his team had helped them. Some left thank you notes, some brought flowers, some just left smiles. Every Friday, Ben would close early and we'd sit outside together watching the sunset. He'd say, Grandma, every time I see that sky, I think about Grandpa and I think about how far we've come. I'd say that's what life's about, honey. It's not about how fast you get there. It's about how much love you bring along the way. Then one winter evening, when snow was falling soft and slow, Ben came to me holding a letter. He said, "Grandma, this came for you." I opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph of a young George standing beside Harold in uniform, smiling. It was worn and faded, but it felt like gold. I turned it over, and on the back in George's handwriting were the words for the road that never ends. I held it close to my heart and whispered, "Thank you, George, you kept your promise." As the years went by, I grew older and slower, but I never stopped visiting that garage. Sometimes when Ben was too busy to notice, I'd sit quietly near the window, just watching him work, the same way I once watched George, the smell of oil and dust mixed with laughter and life, and I thought maybe this was heaven in its own way. One spring morning, I woke up early and went to the garage. The sun was shining just right, and the air smelled of new beginnings. I sat in the old Ford and rested my hands on the steering wheel. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You can rest now, sweetheart. He's carrying it forward now." Later that afternoon, Ben found me asleep there, peaceful and smiling. He said later it felt like Grandpa had finally come to take me for one last ride. He didn't cry. At first, he just sat beside me in the car and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma. Thank you for everything." At the funeral, he spoke softly to everyone gathered. He said, "My grandmother taught me that love is not about holding on, it's about passing it on. She gave me more than stories, she gave me strength, and she showed me that even old things can shine brighter than new ones when they are filled with love." After that day, Ben kept the Ford in perfect condition. He said it wasn't just a car anymore. It was his reminder, his teacher, his legacy. Every year on her birthday, he'd take the Ford out for a drive to that same diner, order a slice of cherry pie and 2 coffees just like she and George once did. He'd set 1 cup across the table, smile softly, and whisper, "Happy birthday, Grandma, we did it." And every time he'd drive back down that long, quiet road, the wind would hum through the windows, and for just a moment he'd swear he could hear her laughter floating somewhere in the breeze. Because love doesn't end when the story does. It lives on in every life it touches, in every road, still traveled in every heart that remembers.